it's important for me to understand the context in which I am relating to that individual, which may not be exclusively race or gender or what have you. The danger of only thinking in those terms is that that becomes the only vision or the only perspective of which I define the nature of my relationships with other people.
Our biggest challenge probably is how do we begin to get groups working together, where groups begin to validate one another, understand one another, and begin to value rather than tolerate the differences that are present.
When you're dealing with issues such as multiculturalism, oppression, and racism, and so forth, that is a very psychological, developmental, emotional process. And I think the same is true is in developing self-awareness. I think where we fall down is, for instance, in areas of psychology and individual counseling, is so individually based that we don't have a systemic way to educate our students.
Welcome this afternoon to our forum of three distinguished panelists. We're going to be speaking to us about multicultural education and counseling. And I think in order for us to give an introduction to the deliberations that we're going to have today, that I'd like each one of them to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their interests, and then we'll move on to some of the issues in the multicultural field. Don?
My name is Don Pope Davis. My area of interest and research is in multicultural counseling, specifically issues of identity, issues relating to cultural competence, and issues of assessment.
Yes, my name is Luis Vasquez, and my interests are more in multicultural counseling and human development, specifically looking at acculturation and bilingual skills of client and counselor and how they're used within that process, and basically the how-to of multicultural counseling.
My name is Daryl Wing Su. My interests are primarily in education and training, and recently I've become much more interested in what we call multicultural organizational development. That is that we're working more and more with how we get organizations, institutions to make changes as opposed to primarily the individual.
And my name is Jerry Stone, and I'm a professor of counseling psychology at the University of Iowa, and also the director of the University Counseling Service, and I will try to facilitate this distinguished group. As a way to start, I wonder if you could help us understand this term multicultural. And a way to do that, for many of us in education and in the human service professions, we come from a long tradition of individual differences, both in terms of assessment and respecting individual differences in the classroom, in the consultation room, and in psychotherapy. How would you help people that have this traditional orientation to individual differences? How would you help them understand how it is different from or enriches our concept of individual differences? And I wonder, Daryl, if we could start with you.
Well, one of the things that that is important for us to understand is that this, to me, indicates that counseling and psychotherapy did originate from this concept of rugged individualism, individual differentiation and differences, and the what we call the educational testing movement. I find that that approach is uniquely Western European in its origin, that there are many cultural groups that we're recognizing now in which the psychosocial unit of operation is not the individual. It resides either with the family, the group, or the collective society. And this is what I feel multiculturalism adds the dimension to. Very few of us in counseling and psychotherapy think beyond the one-to-one counselor-client, the I-thou relationship. And I think that when you focus primarily upon just individuals or individual identity, you're negating a whole aspect of the human condition. One way that I like to frame it is that we actually have 3 levels of identity. What I call the individual level of identity. That is that you and I are uniquely different. We're unique. Even my brother Stan, who shares the same family background, is different. We're individuals in that respect. The second level that people talk about in counseling oftentimes is what they call the universal level of identity, that we're all the same as well. The Shakespearean character who says, "When I cut myself, do I not bleed?" Indicates that we do have universal human qualities that we share. I find the third level, I find the most difficult for counselors to deal with, which is a group level of identity. And that is correlated with ethnicity, race, culture, gender, religious orientation. We, for some reason in our society, find it very difficult to recognize the group level of identity. I find people, for example, have difficulty looking at Don and saying that, geez, I see an African American, or to acknowledge the fact that you're black or that I'm Asian. And frequently I'll hear people say to me, Gerald, when I see you, I don't see you as Asian, I see you as an individual. They don't realize that they've negated a very important aspect of my identity. And what I think multiculturalism is doing is trying to integrate this, get all of us to begin to realize that there are different perspectives and different levels that we all belong to.
That's very helpful. Luis or Don, you want to add to that?
I would like to say that I also believe, not to add to this, is that multiculturalism, if I were to conceptualize it, I would draw for the audience an umbrella with multiculturalism across the top. Under multiculturalism, we'd be looking at the Western worldview, Afrocentric worldview, Latinos, Asians, and so forth, but not as one above another, or in a pecking order, if I were to say, but at an equal level, or at least an integrative level, because all cultures, because of the mixtures over the generations, we are intertwined and integrated at some levels. But it would be an umbrella as such, instead of Western worldview, ethnic race, gender, and then other. So I would, for me, I would have to see it as an umbrella of what multiculturalism, with all the various factors underneath it.
I think, too, to follow along that same line, the notion of, we also have the notion in education that we have in counseling, which Daryl talked about, of the individual. I think when we talk about multicultural, as he correctly stated, I think, it is more than just one. And that's a concept that I think we here in the United States have a very difficult time, because we have we live in a culture and a broader majority culture that values individuality, rugged individualism, independence, and when you think about those things in the broader scope of things, they may be validated by a particular segment of our society. But when you meet an individual that does not value those kinds of things, we are very quick in our society to diagnose this individual as being deficit in some particular areas. If we, however, adopt a multicultural perspective, we recognize that there are differences that are simply different. There is very little need to put a value assessment on it and to say that you are different and therefore difference means negative. I think in a multicultural perspective, we recognize that people bring with them other kinds of things which make up who they are. And it is simply not a matter of simply saying, well, I can work with you, or as I've heard people say, I can work with anyone. I'm a counselor, I've been trained to work with anyone. Well, that's not necessarily the case.
Right. Some authors in the field say that we take that multiculturalism concept to be so broadly defined that I like what you said, that difference sometimes is just difference. Some of the debate is about, are there differences that have value-laden contributions to them because of past history, such as oppression? And how do we make distinct distinctions between differences that are simply different and then differences because of context have a history to them that may add extra value to them. In other words, who's included in multicultural as an authentic difference, and when does that difference simply be different? Who would like to tackle this question? Because there is some debate in the field of how broadly we spread that umbrella to include what differences.
Yes, and it's, you know, I guess I would respond in this manner. Cross-cultural counseling or multicultural counseling can be, if you look at it logically, almost any type of counseling situation can be cross-cultural or multicultural in respect. But sometimes what happens, the fear among a lot of people is that when you broaden it so great, it diffuses the impact and importance of what's going on. And some people have begun to ask, why is it that there are certain groups that are defining multiculturalism so broadly? Is it to avoid dealing with race issues that they find very uncomfortable to deal with? Now, I have the same thing with is multicultural involved in domestic multiculturalism or international multiculturalism? And I guess I would answer that international multiculturalism has similarities to domestic ones. The important point here is that there are a lot of people who prefer to deal with international multiculturalism because it takes it away from their own domestic working through of race culture issues, so that they find that that's pushing buttons in themselves. But there are social political factors that influence how we define how broadly or how narrowly these terms cover.
I've heard the same argument as we probably all have, is that if you broaden this, soon you can have a group of people that look a certain way, and that's multicultural. And I'm not sure that I'm necessarily in favor of that. However, I think we have to be careful not to define this only in socio-political terms that may dictate how we respond when issues arise. To define multiculturalism only in terms of race, by necessity, demands that the worldview or the vision or the perspective that I have is only seen as black and white. In this particular dyad, it may be seen as, but I think there's a danger of not when I see it in that way, there's a danger of seeing it as you versus me, and that's the part that doesn't make me completely comfortable when I only think of it in terms of the racial component. Yet I know from experience, personal and professional experience, that race is an important aspect of it. But also from experience, I know that I am more than just my race. And that's an important dimension. I remember when I first started out in counseling, it was not uncommon for black clients to be referred to me, because someone out there, the clinical coordinator, would say, we've got a black client, let's send this person to Don. The assumption when a person does that, in my mind, is that they're assuming that race is the most salient characteristic. And it ain't necessarily so. And so you need to check that out. And it may be gender, it may be religion, it may be other kinds of things, maybe SES and so forth. That does not minimize the importance of race or gender and all of those things, but it's important for me to understand the context in which I am relating to that individual, which may not be exclusively race or gender or what have you. The danger of only thinking in those terms is that becomes the only vision or the only perspective of which I define the nature of my relationships with other people.
Okay, so go ahead. Okay, I guess for me, when I hear the term all-inclusive, I wonder sometimes, are we talking invisible? And if all-inclusive means to become invisible, then what is our responsibility? And so for me, when we talk about multiculturalism as being all-inclusive, with that, if I were to talk about that, I would take a step back and talk about my intentionality involved and my deliberateness as to what I mean by being all-inclusive. And if that does include becoming invisible and diluting my responsibility, or better yet, me not having any responsibility at all for any or other groups or whatever, then I guess I would have to disagree, that I would have to focus more on what is the intentionality and how do you plan to use this definition, and not only working with others, training others, but within myself. And what privilege is that allowing me to have with that intentionality?
It sounds like this is one of those dilemmas in which of trying to balance the valuing of difference, but yet not diluting it to such an extent that it becomes an invisible, and that all differences are simply different, but that how to maintain that balance of valuing the difference and not diluting it so we include all differences in terms of maintaining a balance. This might lead right into, for our educators and our counselors, of these dilemmas of trying to maintain value and focus, leads us in how we communicate and educate our students, our clients, and our patients, who many of them are going through identity development themselves and trying to find out what pieces of this multidimensional, multicultural context they are going to identify with. There's a debate about how the best way to present this kind of information. One is kind of a focused approach where you have a multicultural course. Another approach is what they call kind of an infusion model, where all through the curriculum, culture and gender and race and ethnicity are brought to bear on different and wide range of courses. What have you found in terms of your experience in education and training in the business sector? A more focused approach, or more infused approach, or a combination? What seems to work?
First of all, I would say that in the work that I've done with business and industry, the whole focus originally of diversity training was on the workers, the workforce. And I would do in-service types of training with the workers, with some of the middle managers, get some changes in understanding of what multiculturalism and diversity was within the workforce. But then I would find that there were areas in which these changes were blunted. And it forced me to begin to look at, for example, if we look at education, when we talk about curriculum changes, and how do we teach students, I began to realize that that really may not be the area to focus in upon. The question and issue might be broader. How do we actually teach teachers to begin to change the way that they perceive what education is all about? And then I asked myself the question, well, what makes teachers teach that way? It's the policies, practices, and way that, for example, the university operates from. And then you have to begin to look at broader aspects of organizational development policies that are discriminatory and that hurt movement from occurring. And that is where I think that we make one of our basic mistakes. We think that we change the classroom, we add a class, we infuse it in the curriculum, and there's no consequent changes in the faculty structure, in promotion and tenure systems, in recruitment policies. And I began to realize that, if we are to be truly multicultural, and the university values multiculturalism, why isn't multiculturalism a criteria for recruitment? Why isn't a criteria for promotion and tenure in the faculty? And that's where I think we have to make basic changes. And I find universities very rigid. They are more likely to give students readings about multiculturalism and change something. But when you talk about these appraisal systems, these systems for how people relate to one another, it is almost, it's it's a huge task.
How about in the curriculum that you are both involved in preparing psychologists and educators and counselors, in terms of, there's probably more models than a focused or an infused model. What seems to work best for you?
I would have to say a combination of both, but along with that, I would have to preface that by saying that also I have yet to meet a colleague, regardless of what level and how many years they've been in the system, that has grown up in such an environment that they are so culturally sensitive, whether it be to gender, ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, and disability. And since none of us have ever really grown up in such an environment, I would have to say that it is difficult when we speak of these issues and yet not acknowledge that we were not trained or born in such environments. And it has to become a collaborative process, not only with the diffusion within the classes or the integration in classes and also the one course, but also among faculty members. When we walk down the halls and we decide to discuss theories or whatsoever, I know that if I talk to certain colleagues, we'll have a common language and a common vocabulary, and we can also share those experiences within the classroom. On the other hand, because of my training, and which was very good training, any of my colleagues could approach me and talk about just about any basic area, whether it be psychology and counseling, and I can hold a very strong conversation and be able to talk about the different aspects and integrate these and be able to conceptualize with my colleagues about these issues. But if I'm talking about multicultural issues, then the population that I have access to and may have the privilege to talk to is greatly reduced. So not only is there the infusion for the class, the single class, and the integration, but also my colleagues and how we as a whole embrace what multiculturalism is, starting from the point of view that we were never born in such an environment, we weren't raised in such an environment, and really our training is happening now, and we're still discovering what that all is. And just being able to admit that and how that gets infused into the appraisal process for tenure and so forth, I think for me would be the place to start. And I know that was a very long answer, but I would have to look at all those aspects.
You know, Jerry, I think for institutions, from my experience, that the notion of diversity and multiculturalism often gets confused. People say one when they mean the other, and so forth. And I think institutions, for instance, I've heard people say we have a very multicultural environment here because we have representation from various racial or ethnic groups, and I like to chuckle about that because and people say, great, we've done our job, and without taking a look at what other kinds of things ought to be done, to really think that through, because you may have diversified the environment. And to talk about the very simple terms, is, you know, when you add people that look different than you in any way, shape, or form, you have diversified your environment. The next level, in my mind, has to do with how do you bring diversity and multiculturalism into the infrastructure of the institutions. And I think one way is to have courses that specifically address these issues. And in fact, I would probably argue that we have had those courses around for many years. There have been, most universities, there have been, I remember where I did my graduate work, there was a Chicano studies program, there was a women's studies program, there was an Asian studies program. I mean, there were opportunities to look at different cultures and so forth. Unfortunately, they were not part of the main infrastructure route that students and individuals took a part of. That's one level that I think needs to continue to be there. So if individuals want that systematic, more in-depth attention to multicultural issues, then that opportunity is there. The other level has to do with faculty, as we've begun to talk, educators, teachers who are teaching curriculum. Can you imagine going to a colleague and saying, the way you have been teaching a particular course for the last 20 years of your life, or the last 10 years of your life, I would like you to change that so it reflects not only the diversity, but the multicultural components of our society. most individuals will probably say, what? Because
academic freedom.
Right,
When
right.
you
Yes.
tell them
Precisely,
that,
precisely,
Power, yes.
precisely. To add to that component, you have that area of many of our instructors in our educational systems were trained at a time when these were not salient issues to be addressed, or differences were to be minimized. And we were supposed to acculturate, or some would say assimilate, people into a mainstream model of doing things. And so what you have to do is to re-educate the educator. And I like Daryl's model of maybe we ought to stop, or I wouldn't say stop, but maybe in conjunction with presenting courses and programs that address these multicultural issues, we ought to also take a look at how can we train the trainers? How can we train, how can we assist, provide an environment, reinforce, and I think I also like what Daryl said about criterias. I would like to see an institution or a program say, you know, one of the criteria for evaluation is multicultural. How has this been demonstrated in your work, in your teaching, and so forth? To have institutions take leadership roles and say, we have a commitment to multiculturalism, therefore everyone we hire must have a commitment to that orientation, not in terms of a mandate, but recognizing the reality of our society. And I think if we can begin to do those things, and we haven't talked about how we do these kinds of things yet, but I think that's part and parcel of the notion, because by doing that, we move from this external, as Luis talked about, this external manifestation of, yes, we are a multicultural environment, and we say, here is how it is part of the institutional structure, so that if the physical representation of this diversity disappears tomorrow, the institution can still bear witness to the fact that something that is permanently part of the institution will always remain.
Well, let's. I'd like to move us now down to some practical challenges here. I think we've established a good beginning discovery of multiculturalism and how we might communicate that in the classroom, in business. I'd like to give voice to some of the students who might be sitting in those classrooms or in that consultation room and see what you think about these challenges. Bring it down to a more concrete kinds of level. Some of our white students might say, well, you know, I hear this presented, and all I kind of do is feel like I ought to feel guilty that, you know, I can't get past that, and I just don't like feeling that way. It's hard for me to hear what you're telling me because I feel like I'm kind of the oppressor here, and I feel guilty, and why should I do that if I feel so badly about it? Our students of color or say, well, that's my experience. I don't have anything to learn here. This is my experience. I come from this community, and I don't know why I need to do those readings or go through these curriculums or have these kinds of discussions. This has been my experience. So why do I need, what do I need to be trained to? I've lived it. I don't need training. How would you kind of address these issues that I think many of you have probably heard before? And how would you deal with some of those student either voiced or unvoiced kinds of concerns?
You know, let's go to this issue of guilt. That is a common response that I get from people undergoing multicultural training in terms of talking about the fact that they feel guilty, defensive, angry, as if we're accusing them of certain things. I think they have to get to the point of asking themselves, what does their whiteness mean to them? Because when I talk about oppression and what has happened in society, when I talk about counseling and psychotherapy as practices that might be cultural oppression, in some sense they are internalizing that my whiteness is equated with all these oppressive acts that you're bringing up at this point. And I ask him to say that, are you going to allow me to define your whiteness for you? Aren't you doing that to yourself? Are you defining yourself in this way that is making you guilty? If you, for example, have an Asian client who tells you that you're just a whitey, how can you possibly understand? If you react defensively and ridden with guilt, are you any help to that individual? So I really want the students to begin to ask them, what does their whiteness mean to them? Guilt doesn't help. And frankly, many racial ethnic minorities, if they sense guilt in the white student, the white administrator, the white colleague. They'll manipulate and use that guilt to get their way. And I remember I have a good friend of mine, David Fry, a white counselor educator, graduated from Purdue. I remember one time he was sitting years ago in what we call the Education Professions Development Act. It was a program funded specifically to train third world counselors, and he was the only white counselor educator in that whole group of African Americans, Asians, Latinos, American Indian professors and instructors, and there was a lot of hostility directed at him. And like they would look at him, and Dave is, you know, he's a pretty large guy, so that the male white impact was clear to what was going on here. And I remember that one African American faculty member would always make these comments directed to Dave, attempting to, I think, elicit guilt, whether it was testing or not. I remember one time Dave looked at him directly and says, "I'm white, let's deal with it." There was no guilt. He was willing to lay his whiteness out there and deal with it. And from then on, his relationship with that faculty member just went forward. And I guess that what I'm asking is that guilt hinders multicultural movement. And the trainer has to be aware of it and have to use the understanding of that. But the white individuals who are going through training eventually have to grapple with what their whiteness means to them, because they have a culture and ethnic background. And if they allow us to define what it is, like what we've done in the past, then we won't move as a group. Race, culture, ethnicity is a function of all of us. It is not an Asian thing, an African American thing, a Latino thing. It includes all of us, and white ethnics as well.
Right. It sounds like guilt is an inadequate motivation for multicultural improvement. What about the students of color in terms of their feeling that they live it, they don't need the educational experiences?
Well, I guess for me, I would have to say that, well, I agree with the fact, now, on what Daryl said about educating the educator here, because I think we, as educators and dealing with students of color, have to also realize that when you're dealing with issues such as multiculturalism, oppression, and racism, and so forth, that is a very psychological, developmental, emotional process. And I think the same is true is in developing self-awareness. I think where we fall down is, for instance, in areas of psychology and individual counseling, is so individually based that we don't have a systemic way to educate our students, such as in family counseling and rehabilitation counseling, where you have to deal with such things as genograms and so forth to begin your own historical search, going back within your own generations, patterns of communications. If there hasn't been any types of relationships between your generations of people of color, and if you're a student of color, have you had interactions with white outside of the classroom, in the workplace, versus within your own family concept, at an intimate level? And what does all that mean? And being able to help students realize, I know for one, for many students of color, the feeling is, I don't need this, I live this. But if we are to be counselors, then I haven't lived where the white rural student comes from. I haven't lived where the white suburban, maybe white, has come from. And if I'm to be a competent counselor and one to work with all these issues, as Gerald has said, in order for me to be ethical and do no harm, I must also know how I impact others, how that impact comes together. And with my experience with students of color, that once they understand the power they hold in being a counselor and the privilege they hold with that position, along comes the responsibility and wanting to know more about themselves and how that interaction takes place. But it's a very tricky process.
Right. So I'm hearing from both of you, and Don, I'll come back to you on that, is that you kind of challenge those reactions, both from the guilt and I've lived it, so there's really nothing that you have to offer to me. Is that what I'm hearing from both?
Definitely. I think definitely. But I think that it goes beyond just, beyond just talking about a white urban things. I think there is an issue of inter-ethnic understanding as well. In the past, I think that what we've done is, like I was saying, reacted towards racial ethnic minorities have banded together in terms of what we call the common enemy hypothesis. That is that white society is seen as the oppressor, and as a result, we needed numerically as a force to deal with it, so that our relationships with one another, and I'm talking about racial ethnic minorities, have been very superficial. We've been allies, but I have not understood, for example, the deeper meaning of what it is to be a Latino, what it is to be an African American, and I find that that's creating a lot of misunderstanding now, because the demographics are changing. We're now getting to the point where, for example, in the year 2025, Hispanics will represent the largest group in the United States, surpassing African Americans. And already we're getting misunderstandings among Koreans and African Americans, so that it's really important, if we are truly dealing with a diverse population, and if we are truly multicultural, it means that all of us have a lot of learning to do.
I know, Don.
I think, well, Daryl has essentially said what I, what I was thinking too is that I like to call it the student that says, I have arrived, I don't need this, and so one of the ways you deal with that is to talk about some of the realities he has just mentioned. Additionally, too, when a student says that, particularly in terms of the thousands of people out there that are going to be in need of clinical help. If I phrase this in terms of a clinical situation, and you say to that student, do you mean to tell me that the only clients you intend, you're in private practice, is one of the examples I use, this is your livelihood, and you have this particular orientation and say that you've arrived, you don't need to know how to work with anybody else. What implications does that have in terms of your livelihood? And people tend to begin to think some of that through, because once you impact financial and other certain kinds of things, there's an attempt to say, well, maybe there are some things I need to learn. I think in some of the classes that I have taught where students have said that, I have challenged that. If a student has said to me, I don't need this, my first response is usually, okay, before you drop this class, today I would like you to demonstrate what this looks like. Show me. Show me. I'll be your client. Show me what multicultural counseling looks like. Even the experts have problems with demonstrating that. So I know that from what I've read and my experiences, and so I asked the student to provide me the opportunity. I have yet to find a student of color that has been able to do that. And that validation or invalidation makes the issue crystal clear, and recognize and encourage the student to recognize that there is more to learn. Just as education is developmental, becoming multiculturally competent is multicultural. It is an ongoing process. At the point at which any individual says, I have arrived, look out.
Right. Well, I'm wondering, in terms, we've been speaking about the challenges that might come from students. There are so many other challenges that we could talk about. I'm going to list a few, and as I'm doing that, you may want to think here in terms of a way to summarize here what you think in the future are some of the challenges that lie ahead. But some of the challenges we haven't had enough time to think about is the issue of the physical environment in which a business is located, a school, a community mental health center. How do they use the physical environment in such a way to show a valuing of cultural differences without and avoiding the problem of stereotyping or objectification? So the whole physical environment is a challenge to infuse a multicultural environment. We could speak about the use of language in education, in therapy. If language is learned, a different language is learned when they're growing up, emotionality is attached to that particular language, and then we might force them in school, in therapy, to use a different language, and how much connection do they have in making the connection. So there are a lot of challenges. We've heard them as we've tried to give some voice to students. But I wonder in the few remaining moments, and we can kind of go in a round here, what you see are the important challenges for you as an educator in terms of what it means to be multicultural as we're approaching the end of the century here. And we can start wherever. Everyone's pointing, and this is a real challenge to see who's going to have the
Well, we've always let Don go first, but then he takes too long.
Yes. This will be brief challenge.
Brief challenges.
Then maybe you ought to start.
Well, let me be the brave one here. In my view, I strongly believe that there has to be a dismantling of how we train our students from kindergarten and even within the home. I feel that as educators, we need to understand that when I get these students in my classes, and I'm sure others have experiences, that there's been many years of learning how to think linearly, linear thinking, how to categorize, how to compartmentalize, and then they enter my course. And so for me, dismantling that whole philosophy of what education is and how it relates to how we think, and not about others or anything, but just our linear thinking process. Along with that is this whole notion of, and what I have coined in my classes as the ethnic barometer, the ethnic racial barometer. As far as when students come from such a linear thinking process, we have to be very careful in looking at the total picture going into the year 2000 or so, that thinking process has to be expanded and more multidimensional, and also being able to look at what do I mean by ethnic barometer and racial barometer. Let's get away from categorizing. Let's get away, even among students of color as well as others, as we walk around with that ethnic barometer and see if you're Latino enough, if you're Asian enough, if you're multicultural enough, and get to the basics of dismantling that whole linear process and begin to deal with each other with respect and affirmation. And I think the challenges of educators like ourselves would be not to teach multiculturalism at the university level, but begin it at the kindergarten level. And I'll give you one brief example. I went to my son's preschool, and he has Asian American, African Americans, and others. It's amazing. The only time they ever get, and many of them speak many different languages, the only time that they get in a conflict is when one wants the toy that another one has. But it's not done with racial slurs and so forth. And they all play together. And it's amazing to see that happen. And it's one of the few times that we start together. Or either that, and as the commercial shows, or we're in the cemetery. And so, for me, it's that whole linear and dismantling that whole philosophy of thinking.
Thank you, Luis.
Yeah. I think that where we need to move to two concepts, and I'll say a little bit about it. One is we need to move to what I like to call cognitive diversity. That is a way of thinking. Now, if you're a behaviorist, you might say we need to modify the behavior first and so forth. But I think that's part of it too. But we have to begin to challenge the way people think about things, and this may relate to Luis's notion of linear way of thinking. I think cognitive diversity is what which defined for me means recognizing that there is a continuum in terms of how things are processed, how things are interpreted, and so forth. It is not limited to only one way of thinking. It's a continuum. I think a multicultural orientation begs for a continuum, requires a continuum of which behavior becomes a relative concept depending on who is defining it. The other part of that for me has to do with education. I wholeheartly agree that what we need to, where we perhaps ought to begin to spend our energy is with our kids. So that when my son or my daughter reaches a college environment, the issue of diversity is no longer an issue that becomes explosive, but it is taken for granted as germane to the institution and so forth. I quite frankly don't hold much hope, unfortunately, for my colleagues who are faculty members today or people who run institutions. And I say that not to be negative, but more to recognize the realization that many of my colleagues who are out there have been away from educational learning for a long time. I think most faculty administrators get in a mode of only teaching and minimizing the learning component, the I have arrived notion, and therefore there's not a lot that you have to try very hard. Now, that is not to say you cannot provide incentives for these individuals to change their curriculum, to change their way of thinking, but invariably I find you continue to preach to the choir. And so I think our efforts ought to be placed elsewhere. I like the idea that Daryl mentioned earlier about teacher training. Teachers who are going to go out into the schools, that's where we introduce them these notions of multiculturalism and diversity. I think that's what we need, that's where we need to begin to put some of our emphasis. If we don't, whether they like it or not, in the next century they're going to have to deal with a harsh reality. I think some businesses are beginning to change, not because they want to, but they recognize the reality. The world is becoming much more diverse, much more multicultural, and if they are going to have some kind of profit and impact that society and have them buy their products, they have to become more multicultural in their orientation. I think educational institutions, educators need to recognize that same kind of thing. If institutions do not change, they will become obsolete.
Thanks, Don.
Can I say ditto? Or let me just briefly. The question is real broad, and you know it's complex in terms of how we address it and ask it. And all I can say is that our biggest challenge probably is how do we begin to get groups working together, where groups begin to validate one another, understand one another, and begin to value rather than tolerate the differences that are present. And I keep thinking about, in graduate school, the old Sharif studies about intergroup hostility, rivalry. I really believe that the answers lie there. That what he found was that to get groups to stop the rivalry, the conflict, the discrimination that went on, conditions had to exist, and those conditions are, one, an equal status relationship among the participants, two, cooperation, and three, to achieve mutually shared goals. And I still believe strongly that our society has to move, and education has to move to that direction too. But the question then becomes, how come, if we have these large answers, haven't we moved towards it? And I think that it becomes clear to me, the answer, when you talk about an equal status relationship, I think the key is there. An equal power relationship, an equal distribution of understanding that I feel does not exist, and that's where I see our major focus needs to be addressed now.
Well, I want to thank each one of you for bringing thoughtful reflection to the area of multiculturalism in education and counseling and passion. And I invite you to this arena to engage it, to value it, and the thoughtful reflection and the passion.